Hi, and welcome back to Gen Z Bible class, where we continue the exciting story of Joseph and all the interesting things that are going on in his life. Last time we were kind of following the ups and downs of his life, and we think about where he started out as one of his father's favorite sons, which didn't go over so well with his brothers, which got him to the point where they were so mad at him they wanted to kill him, and they sold him into slavery instead of killing him. In case you weren't with us before, we just want to keep up with what's going on in the life of Joseph. So he ends up in Egypt, and he actually, as a slave, gets a pretty good job working for a wealthy person there. Gets into a little trouble with that guy's wife and ends up in prison. But even in prison, he does pretty well because they put him in charge of the prison. It's there that he learns that he's able to interpret dreams. He's had a few dreams of his own, which are starting to come true. And as a result, he ends up, this is making a long story very short, he ends up standing before Pharaoh himself, who had a dream, and explains to him the meaning of that dream. And the meaning of the dream was that there was going to be 7 good years of harvest, followed by 7 years of famine. Okay, in case you missed before, that gets us kind of up to date, and this is where we are right now. And Pharaoh has so much confidence in Joseph that he puts him in charge of pretty much the whole country, because they had this warning, there's going to be 7 years of good crops, abundant crops, followed by 7 years of famine. So this gives them the opportunity to get organized and to put away a lot of food, saving it, just like little ants do. They put away their food all summer long so that they can get through the winter. And that's pretty much what was going on here. So this last couple of chapters has been pretty much this story about Joseph and how he ends up in this position with all the ups and downs in his life. It's just pretty amazing. But now his family, we haven't heard much about them. What happens to Jacob and Joseph's other brothers? What's going on with them? And this is where now, in chapter 42, they come back into the story. And now we did read the very last, I think the last verse that we read in chapter 41, made it clear that this famine was something that was going to extend way beyond just Egypt. So it extends into Canaan, where Jacob and Joseph's brothers were. And this is where they kind of come back into the whole storyline. They learn about the fact that there's food in Egypt, and they start running out of food themselves. And so they decide to make a little trip down to Egypt to see if they can procure some food. And that's where we start. We'll start at verse 3 in Genesis 42. Then 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with the others, because he was afraid that harm might come to him. So Israel's sons were among those who went to buy grain, for there was famine in the land of Canaan also. Well, I can understand why Jacob didn't want to send Benjamin. I mean, from his perspective, he already lost, or at least he thinks he lost Joseph. And, he only has this one favored son left. I mean, we hate to say it, but those two of his sons, Joseph and Benjamin, were his favorites because they were from the wife that he loved. And I guess there's a lesson there about family and, how to make a dysfunctional family. It's usually good to have one man, one woman, and then whatever children they have, that's the best formula for any kind of marriage. All right, so they head down to Egypt, and this is what happens next in verse 7. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. "Where do you come from?" he asked. "From the land of Canaan," they replied, "to buy food." Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. And then he remembered his dreams about them and said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see where our land is unprotected." Wow, yeah, I wouldn't have expected that. They appear before Joseph, and I was kind of wondering, I wonder if Joseph thought this might be a possibility, because by this time, they had come, this time in the time frame, they have come into this time of famine. And that's, of course, why they go to Egypt, which is interesting if you think about it, because their grandfather, Abraham, had the exact same experience where there was a famine in Canaan and he had to go down to Egypt to save his family. Well, they appear before Joseph, of course, them not knowing that Joseph is their brother, but he knowing that they are his brothers. And as I said, I don't know if he was maybe expecting that they might show up at some point, because pretty much everybody else was. Well, I can understand why they wouldn't have recognized him, because he was probably just a teenager. And I think people have figured out, they've calculated, when he left and when he was sold into slavery, that by this time he is probably around 39. Somebody did the math and looked at the genealogies and figured by this time, so he's a grown man. Plus, even if they thought maybe he looked a little bit like their brother, the last thing they would have thought was that their brother, who they sold into slavery, is now second in command in Egypt. I mean, it wouldn't have computed with them. Well, what is this deal about Joseph then and his reaction? I mean, he knows who they are, but he accuses them of being spies. Why is that? Why doesn't he just say, "Oh man, I'm so glad to see you guys. I'm your brother." This doesn't quite happen yet. And why is that? Well, I think there's a few reasons. One is because Joseph himself he hadn't seen them in years, many years. And he doesn't really know where they are in their minds. And I think he's putting them through a little bit of a test. And he also wants to learn some things about his family without acknowledging the fact that he is their brother. Now, why does he keep this a secret from them? I'm not real sure. But, of course, eventually he does disclose this. I think, again, it might have been kind of a time of testing for his brothers to see what they were thinking, to see if maybe they had a repentant heart for what they did to him. So, anyway, we continue on. And, of course, they deny that, no, we're not slaves, and, we've come from Canaan, and we are, our family has 12 brothers, and our father is back home. And Joseph, now in verse 14, says to them, "It is just as I told you, you are spies, and this is how you will be tested. As surely as Pharaoh lives, you will not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of your number to get your brother. The rest of you will be kept in prison, so that your words may be tested to see if you are telling the truth. If you are not, then as surely as Pharaoh lives, you are spies." And he put them all in jail for 3 days. Well, I think that this kind of makes sense, because if he's insisting that they're spies, and they've told him this story about this other brother that they have, so in order to prove that they're not spies, he tells them, of course he has ulterior motives for this, because he wants to see his brother, his only full brother that he has. And he tells them, okay, to prove to me you're not spies, I want you to go home and bring your brother, Benjamin, to me. Well, now they're really in kind of a conundrum here. And I think the interesting thing here is that they're telling him this story, but they're not telling him the whole story. They do mention that there were 12 brothers and that one of them is no more. Of course, he knows where the one who is no more is, because he is the one who they think is no more. And I think it's just such an interesting situation. And now you have them talking amongst themselves and, trying to determine what what kind of situation they're in. And this is in verse 21. So they said to one another, "Surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life. But we would not listen, and that's why this distress has come upon us." Reuben replied, "Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. Now we must give an account for his blood." They did not realize that Joseph could understand them since he was using an interpreter. So this gets more and more interesting. Joseph had never let on that he could understand them. As far as they knew, he was Egyptian, or they never heard him speak their language, and they must have been within earshot of Joseph for him to overhear what they were saying. And maybe, I'm not sure how he would have felt about that, but maybe he felt good about the fact that they did express this guilt. And there's a real lesson there about trying to hide something and hold on to it for all those years. You think about, this has been like 12, 13 years, I'm not sure how long since they had seen him, and certainly didn't know anything about him. But they had to keep that secret from their father for all those years and just kind of hold it in. Now, this is something that is probably a bit of a lesson for us when we try to hide things from God. He knows our language. He knows what's going on, and we cannot hide things from God. So the best policy is to, what do they always say? Honesty is the best policy. Anyway, well, they have to go home now, and he allows them to go home. He makes a new agreement with them that they have to keep one of the brothers there. So he shows a little bit of mercy and lets them all go home, but he keeps Simeon. I'm not sure why he chose Simeon. Remember, Simeon is the one that came up with that plan to kill all their neighbors through that trickery earlier in their lives. So Simeon was maybe kind of a hothead, and I don't know if that's why he chose him or not. Maybe we'll never know. But now they have to go home, and they have to tell Jacob, give him a report on all this stuff. And I don't think Jacob was too happy to hear all of this, but they have to explain everything to him, and he gets kind of upset with them, and he says, "Why did you end up telling him all this stuff?" And they explain to him, "Well, we had to tell him what he asked us. He was asking us all these questions about our family and about our younger brother." And Jacob is starting to see here that things are not going to go so well in terms of him being able to keep Benjamin at home. So they make it clear that if we go back there for more food, then Benjamin is going to have to go with us. In verse 36, Jacob said to them, "You have deprived me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and now you want to take Benjamin. Everything is against me." And then Reuben said to his father, "You may put both my sons to death if I did not bring him back to you. Entrust him to my care, and I will bring him back." Reuben seems to be the one that, you remember, he was the one that said, "I told you guys that we shouldn't have done this." And he was the one that was trying to save Joseph. Of course, once they went in the direction that they did, they had to keep all this a secret from Jacob, which is never a good thing to do, as we said. And yet they kind of explained the situation, and Reuben ends up kind of taking the responsibility here and saying, "Yeah, this is just something we're going to have to do." So they get to the point where the food that they had come back with ends up running out sooner or later. Of course, that's going to happen, and it seemed like it might have been a couple of years that they were able to get by with the food that he had. But now the famine is kind of catching up with them, and we read about that now in verse 1 of chapter 43. Now the famine was still severe in the land, so when they had eaten all the grain they had brought from Egypt, their father said to them, "Go back and buy us a little more food." And it was here where one of the sons, Judah, reminds him that we're going to have to take Benjamin with us. We cannot go back there. We sort of dug this hole. We got ourselves into this situation. And, this is why he was so upset with him. Why did you tell him all this stuff? And, they had to explain to him that we had no choice because he was asking, why is he so curious about us? Of course, we know why, because he was trying to get information about his very own family. Well, finally, Jacob concedes, and he said, their father, in verse 11, chapter 43, verse 11, then their father Israel, now remember his name is changed from Jacob to Israel, said to them, "If it must be, then do this. Put some of the best products of the land in your bags and take them down to the man as a gift. A little balm, a little honey, some spices and some myrrh, some pistachio nuts and almonds. Take double the amount of silver with you." And, this, I guess it makes sense. It was the obvious thing to do, but he concedes that he's going to have to send Benjamin and just, hope that what Reuben said, that he would take care of him, just to trust him that he'll see his son once again. And of course, this does happen. He does get to see his son again. He has to accept this situation. And this is where it gets kind of interesting to me because, as we said, these Old Testament stories, they are history. These are things that really happened. But sometimes we can see spiritual principles illustrated within them. And now we see that Jacob is forced to give up his most precious son. That's exactly what happened with Abraham and Isaac. That's what happened when Isaac had to send Jacob away. Each one of them had a favorite son, and each one of them had to give up that son, at least for some time, and to be willing to do that. And here's a picture of the way God has given us his son. God gave up his son so that we could be saved. And you see, this pattern is kind of like a spiritual pattern that's illustrated in what goes on here in this story. Well, they pack up their bags again. I guess by now they're getting familiar with this trip back and forth to Egypt. And they bring all these gifts, and once again they appear before Joseph. And just before they meet him, this was the conversation that they had in verse 18 of chapter 43. Now the men were frightened when they were taken to Joseph's house. They thought, "We were brought here because of the silver that was put back into our sacks the first time. He wants to attack us and overpower us and seize us as slaves and take our donkeys." Don't take my donkeys. Oh my goodness. Well, this is all based on probably a logical sort of fear, but I think a lot of it goes back to the fact that they had this guilt. And that's a lesson that we can learn. You have this guilt, and what do we use this term, karma, or whatever, bad karma, whatever you do, whatever you sow comes back upon you. What goes around comes around, or however you want to say it. But I think that the reason they were facing him with such fear or apprehension was because of this guilt that they had. They didn't necessarily have a logical reason to fear him. But what happens next probably surprised them, because he throws a big party for them. He goes off and he says, "I want you to prepare a feast for these." Well, he didn't tell anybody that they were his brothers yet, but of course we know that that was one of the reasons. And he prepares this feast and invites them to this feast. So, this was probably good news for them, and they get all their gifts ready to present to him. And what happens next is Joseph comes in, and we read about this in verse 26. He came home, and they presented to him the gifts that they had brought into the house, and they bowed down before him to the ground. He asked them how they were, and then he said, "How is your aged father that you told me about? Is he still living?" They replied, "Your servant, our father, is still alive and well." And they bowed down, prostrating themselves before him. Of course, he's curious. I mean, maybe they're wondering, why is he so curious about our father and our family and, this younger brother? Maybe it certainly hasn't dawned on them yet that he is their brother, but maybe they're starting to wonder a little bit. But the interesting thing here is we have this picture, and it's mentioned twice, that they bowed down before Joseph, prostrating themselves before him. And this goes back to that dream that Joseph had when he was just a young man. He actually had two dreams, if you recall. One of them was that he had like these sheaves, and his sheaf was so much bigger than all the other ones, and all those other sheaves of grain or corn or whatever it was bowed down to his. And he told his brothers this dream, and that did not win him any brownie points with them. That kind of made them angry. And then he had a second dream where he saw the sun and the moon and 11 stars bowing down before him. And this really ticked them off. And maybe that was one of the reasons why they decided to try to kill him. And even his father at that point was a little, "Are you saying that we're going to bow down before you?" Of course, that whole scenario would have seemed impossible back when he was just a young man. But now we're seeing the fulfillment of that dream. That dream was very prophetic. And they literally are, now his 11 brothers are bowing before him because they are totally under his authority at this time. In verse 29, it says that as he looked around and saw his brother Benjamin, his own mother's son, he asked, "Is this your youngest brother?" Of course, he knew that it was. "The one you told me about." And he said, "God be gracious to you, my son." Deeply moved at the sight of his brother, Joseph hurried out and looked for a place to weep. Then he went into his private room and wept there. You can only imagine the emotions that must have been a part of, Joseph during this time. Having seen this brother, and I don't really know how old his brother was when he left. He had been born. We know that because his mother, Rachel, had died giving birth to him. And if they were really close, we don't really know. But this was the only blood brother, full brother, that Joseph had. And he certainly wasn't getting a whole lot of love from all his other half-brothers. They were the ones that were trying to kill him. So this just must have been such an emotional time for him. And I think that's why he has to go off and kind of hide and, comes back after he kind of regains his composure. He washes his face and he seats them all. And we read about this in verse 33. The men had been seated before him in the order of their ages, from the firstborn to the youngest, and they looked at each other in astonishment. When the portions were served them from Joseph's table, Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as everyone else's. So they feasted and drank freely with him. Now, that just must have seemed so strange to them as well, because he tells them, I want you to sit here, you to sit here, and he lines them all up in order of their age. You would think maybe they're getting a little suspicious at this point. How does he know this? Why, to begin with, is he so interested in us? Of course, this is actually where this part of the story ends in chapter 43, and this is where we're going to kind of put an end to what the part we're going to read and look forward to. Well, yes, eventually Joseph does reveal himself to them, but I want to think just a little bit about this whole situation as they are reintroduced to Joseph. And I think one of the things that we can see here very clearly is that God's plan is now starting to unfold. We can think about those dreams that Joseph had when he was young and see how now his brothers literally do come and bow before him. But there's another way in which prophecy was fulfilled in this whole situation. And I don't know if you remember it or not, but when we were talking about Abraham, and God had appeared to him a number of times, and one of the times that God was speaking to him and telling him all about, these promises that he was going to make to him, amazingly enough, he also tells Abraham that your descendants, your family, are going to go to Egypt, and they're going to be there as slaves for 400 years. I'm not sure what Abraham would have made of all of that. And of course, he doesn't really live to see this all coming about, but this is a fulfillment of that prophecy. Now they are in Egypt, and we're going to see eventually how the whole family ends up moving back there. But this is how God is unfolding this plan that he had in mind all along. And we learn something about the way God does things. He brings Joseph. It doesn't go directly from point A to point B. There's a lot of things that happen to get things to line up for this all to occur. God uses this famine, this situation, to accomplish his purpose. I think there's also another spiritual lesson in all of this. And it has something to do with the cost of a guilty conscience. And, these guys were sitting there not realizing that Joseph was their brother, but thinking, this is all happening to us because of what we did to him. And there's another picture here, and maybe this is, even clearer when we think about how God receives us. Now, Joseph is sitting there knowing full well who these guys are. And he has to decide, is he going to get even with them? And man, he really could have. He could have taken their lives, accused them of being spies and either put them in jail or, cut their heads off. But he wasn't. That wasn't the way he felt. He really knew, I think Joseph himself knew, that this was God accomplishing his purpose. And we're going to see him actually admit that later on, that this is God doing his will. And so his attitude toward them is not one of revenge and not one of getting even, but he is responding to them with mercy and with joy, and opening his arms to receive them. And this is before they even know who he was. And that's exactly what God does with us, and he does for us. Because, we carry a lot of guilt. We talk about the sin, that Adam and Eve did in the garden, and how we've been the recipients of that sinful nature. And so we all have this guilt when we think about ourselves compared to God. And how does God respond to us? Well, it could be by judgment, because we certainly do deserve that, but he responds to us in the same way that Joseph responded to his brothers, in mercy and in love. I think that's another really good picture that we can take from all of this. Now, we're going to see in the future how Joseph eventually does reveal himself to his brothers. And we have this, wonderful family reunion, probably one of the best family reunions in the whole Bible. And that's what we're going to be looking at next time as we move on to chapter 44 and 45. And I hope that you will be able to be with us then on Gen Z Bible class.